The CIA once spent millions trying to answer a question most people laugh at. Could someone spy on somebody else on the other side of the world using only their mind? Believe it or not, that's exactly what they did. Come sit, get comfy, it's After Dark. You know, the more I do research on these topics, the more I realize that almost every rabbit hole leads to World War II. That war changed history forever. It changed the way governments looked at science and technology, even the human mind. After that, it became a race to discover the next big thing before your enemy did. Sometimes that meant rockets, nuclear weapons, mind control, and sometimes it meant spending millions of dollars trying to figure out if someone could spy on someone on the other side of the world using their mind. Tonight we're talking about one of the strangest intelligence programs ever funded by the US government. A program that sounds completely out there until you realize that it actually happened. And probably is still happening today. But before we get to Stargate, we need to go back to a very dark period. Not because this is another history lesson, it's because none of this makes sense without understanding the world that created it. The Second World War didn't just reshape the map of the world, it reshaped the map of the human mind. After 1945, governments realized scientific discoveries could decide who ruled the future. The atomic bomb had changed everything. Operation Paperclip quietly brought hundreds of German scientists to the United States. The CIA was then created in 1947. The Cold War followed almost immediately. From that moment on, every breakthrough mattered. If the Soviets discovered something first, America wanted it too. Sometimes that meant rockets, satellites, sometimes psychology, and sometimes the ideas so strange they sounded impossible. That mindset led to one of the CIA's darkest chapters, MK Ultra. Beginning in 1953, Sidney Gottlieb, a huge piece of shit, and the CIA secretly experienced with LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, electroshock, and countless other techniques, again inspired by the Nazis, on people who did not provide consent. Their goal wasn't curiosity, it was control. They wanted to know how far the human mind can be manipulated. The program eventually collapsed after journalists exposed it, and Congress began asking questions. Officially, that chapter was over, but I'm sure it's still going on today. But who knows? The obsession with the human mind never disappeared. It simply changed direction. Instead of asking whether the mind could be controlled, the government started wondering whether it could do something we didn't fully understand. And that question became Project Stargate. So this is the 1970s. The Cold War is in full swing. American intelligence starts receiving reports that the Soviet Union is pouring money into psychic research, not ghost hunting, military research. So whether those reports were completely accurate almost didn't matter. The CIA had learned one lesson after World War II: never assume your enemy is wasting their time. So instead of dismissing the idea, they quietly opened their wallets. The research began at Stanford Research Institute in California, better known as SRI. Two physicists led the work. Their names, Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff. Their assignment was surprisingly simple. Find out whether ordinary people could accurately describe places they had never seen. No maps, no photographs, no clues, only coordinates and their own minds. At first, almost everyone thought the idea was absurd. And then they met Ingo Swann. If Stargate has a father, it's probably Ingo Swann. He wasn't a military officer, he wasn't a scientist, he was an artist with an unusual ability. Researchers handed him nothing more than a string of numbers, coordinates. He would sit quietly, write down the first impression that entered his mind, and sketch what he saw. The method eventually became known as coordinate remote viewing. The idea was to stop people from guessing. No target names, no hints, just raw impressions. To everyone's surprise, some sessions appeared unusually accurate. Accurate enough that intelligence agencies wanted to continue. Then came Pat Price. If Ingo Swann helped shape remote viewing, Pat Price became one of its biggest success stories. Before joining the program, Price had worked as a police commissioner in Burbank, California. He wasn't a scientist or a military officer. He was simply someone who seemed to have an unusual ability. When researchers at the Stanford Research Institute began testing him, they were reportedly stunned by how accurate some of his sessions were. Puthoff and Targ later described him as one of the most gifted remote viewers they had ever worked with. Price would sit in a room, close his eyes, and attempt to describe locations thousands of miles away using nothing more than target coordinates. One of his most famous sessions involved a secret Soviet military complex. He described large gantry cranes, underground structures, security checkpoints, and industrial buildings. Supporters later claimed satellite intelligence matched many of those details, while skeptics argued the descriptions were too general to prove remote viewing had actually occurred. As his confidence grew, so did his claims. Price said he had perceived highly secret underground facilities, and in later accounts, he even claimed to have seen hidden bases associated with non-human intelligence here on Earth. I mean, there's no publicly verified evidence confirming them, and they remain extraordinary claims. I still believe it. Then in 1975, the story took another strange turn. Pat Price died suddenly of a heart attack while staying in a hotel in Las Vegas. He was only 57 years old. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but because of his classified work, rumors quickly spread. Some believed he had simply died of natural causes. Others speculated he had been poisoned because he knew too much. To this day, there is no evidence proving foul play. These are not uncommon when you start researching in this area. Sudden deaths only added another layer of mystery to an already unbelievable story. Pat Price he seemed like a genuine, honest person, so I tend to believe everything he says. So now, if Pat Price was one of the most successful remote viewers, then Joe McMoneagle is not too far behind. Joe wasn't a psychic by trade. He was a highly decorated U.S. Army intelligence officer and Vietnam veteran. He served for years in military intelligence before being recruited into what would eventually become Project Stargate. Joe often says everything changed after a near-death experience in Vietnam. He survived, but he felt something about his perception had changed. A few years later, the Army began testing him. Inside Stargate, Joe became known as Remote Viewer Number 1. Over the course of the program, he completed thousands of remote viewing sessions, supporting both research experiments and real intelligence operations. What makes Joe different from many people, in my opinion, he never claimed to be perfect. In fact, he often says, remote viewing isn't like watching a movie. It's more like trying to remember a dream or putting a puzzle together. You get flashes, you get impressions, symbols. Sometimes they're incredibly accurate, and sometimes they're completely wrong. One of his most famous sessions involved a massive Soviet submarine that was still under construction inside a secret shipyard. Given nothing but a set of coordinates, Joe described an enormous submarine hidden inside a building. Years later, the Soviet Union unveiled the Typhoon-class submarine. Supporters believe Joe described it years before the West publicly knew what it looked like. Skeptics argue they may already have been fragments of intelligence available, making it impossible to know exactly how much of the description came from remote viewing. Then, one of the juiciest sessions in the entire Stargate archive, in my opinion, the CIA handed Joe a set of coordinates and a date, approximately 1 million years BC. The target? Mars. Joe later described towering pyramids, humanoid figures, and what appeared to be the final days of a civilization trying to survive a dying planet. The transcript is real. The session is publicly available in the CIA's declassified files. Whether Joe was seeing history or it was his imagination, nobody knows. Today he continues to write books, give interviews, and teach remote viewing through the Monroe Institute, where students from around the world can learn the techniques he helped develop. He also appears in interviews and on YouTube discussing Stargate, consciousness, and what he learned during the decades of remote viewing. Whether you believe remote viewing is real or not, Joe McMoneagle remains one of the most studied and documented figures ever associated with the phenomenon. And more than 50 years later, he's still asking the same question that started it all. What is the human mind actually capable of? The story didn't end. Remote viewing never disappeared. Former Stargate viewers still teach the techniques today. The Monroe Institute continues researching altered states of consciousness. Thousands of civilians now practice coordinate remote viewing. Some use it for personal exploration. Others claim to help locate missing people, solving criminal cases, but none of those applications have broad scientific acceptance yet. But the interest hasn't faded. If anything, it's growing massively, especially now that conversation about consciousness, meditation, psychedelics, and the nature of reality have become much more mainstream than they were 50 years ago. The thing that fascinates me isn't whether every remote viewing session was successful. It's more that serious governments quietly invested years and millions of dollars exploring something most of us were thought to dismiss. Maybe they stumbled onto something real but couldn't reliably measure it. Maybe consciousness is simply far stranger than we currently understand. So many questions. And I don't think we've reached the end of this one yet. Stay curious. I'll see you in the next one, After Dark.